The Grabbe family was easily one of the most prominent and wealthiest families in the tiny farming town of Marshall, Illinois. The family had gained their notoriety and the majority of their wealth from the inheritance that Charlotte Grabbe received after her parents passed away. But that wasn't where it all came from. Both Charlotte and her husband Fred were extremely hard workers, spending their days from sunrise until sunset, farming their fields. On the outside, they appeared to be a perfect and stable family. But on the inside, Charlotte knew that something was very, very wrong. Over the course of their second marriage, Charlotte and Fred had 2 children together, who they named Jeff and Jenny. Fred and Charlotte had been married and divorced once before because Fred was not the most faithful husband out there. But later on, the two reconciled and remarried. But now, Fred was back to his old tricks, and it looked as though their second marriage was on its way to divorce again. Fred was a serial womanizer, and at 42 years old, he had a fascination with younger women. In fact, it was not unusual for Fred to have a few girlfriends on the side at any given time. And one of those girlfriends was a 24-year-old bartender with curly blonde hair named Vicky McAllister. Fred was a gigantic man, standing at 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighing almost 300 pounds. He towered over his tiny wife, Charlotte. This in itself was nothing to worry about, but Fred was also a very violent man and was quick to lose his temper. And that, combined with his enormous size, was just a very dangerous situation for Charlotte, because Fred had absolutely no problem laying his hands on her or his kids. As time went on, Charlotte eventually found out about Fred's latest affair that he was having with Vicky McAllister. Charlotte, feeling sad and defeated, came to the conclusion that Fred was not going to change his ways. And so, feeling like she was left with no other choice, she filed for divorce from Fred for the second time. After this, Fred packed up his belongings and moved out of the family home and into a cabin that was situated on the property of the family farm. After she filed for divorce, Charlotte felt like she was in constant danger. Her relationship with Fred had taken such a drastic downturn that she had no doubt whatsoever that Fred was actually willing to kill her if he just decided to one day. Charlotte was so aware of this reality that she had even instructed Jeff and Jenny, her 2 kids, to come looking for her if she wasn't back at the house by the end of the day at the end of each workday. Shortly after the sun had set on July 24th of 1981, Jeff and Jenny noticed that Charlotte had not returned to the house, and because of this, they knew something was wrong. Their mother had gone out to the soybean field on her tractor, but had not returned home yet, and so Jeff and Jenny set out towards the field to try to find her. Once they were out there and didn't immediately see any tractor in the fields, they headed towards the machine shed where the tractor was normally parked, and sure enough, there was their mother's tractor, inside the shed, safe and sound. But Charlotte was nowhere to be found. As they looked around the tractor, trying to find their mother, or any clue of where she may be, they found something that told them something was very wrong. There, resting on the front tire of the tractor, was Charlotte's lunchbox. Jeff and Jenny had no doubt that something had happened to their mother. Seeing Charlotte's lunchbox there with no sign of Charlotte prompted Jenny to immediately turn and walk out of the machine shed and head straight to their house, where she picked up the phone and reported her missing to the Clark County Sheriff. It didn't take long for the sheriff to arrive either, and when he did, he questioned Fred first. Fred freely admitted that they had been fighting, but he told the sheriff that the last time he had seen Charlotte, she was driving her car towards the interstate highway towards Indiana. Only a few days later, after the sheriff spoke with Fred, Charlotte's car was found 16 miles away across the state border in Indiana. The strange thing was, though, that contrary to Fred's story about Charlotte driving her car that day, a friend of Charlotte's told the sheriff that she had seen Fred driving his truck towards Indiana with someone following behind him in Charlotte's car. That someone was definitely not Charlotte. Instead, it was a young, blonde woman with curly hair. Charlotte had brown straight hair. For 3 long years, the whereabouts of Charlotte Grabbe remained a mystery. Charlotte's case went cold, and eventually her daughter Jenny grew tired of not knowing what happened to her mother. She was determined to put an end to the mystery, and so Jenny hired a private investigator, Charles Pearson. Once Pearson was brought up to speed on all of the available facts, he decided to pour his energy into the clue of the curly-haired, blonde woman driving Charlotte's car. Pearson had a pretty good idea of who this woman was anyway, so he set out to find Fred's former mistress, Vicki McAllister. Vicki was now living in Indiana, and so that's where Pearson found her. He observed her movements for a little while, getting to know her habits and routine, and then, when he seen his opportunity, he started going to the bars that she frequented. And over the course of a few weeks, they got to know each other, having some drinks and playing pool. As these encounters increased in frequency, Vicki began to trust Pearson, and when he felt like maybe they were at the point of calling one another friends, Pearson finally admitted to her who he really was and why he had befriended her. Instead of being angry and yelling at Pearson, Vicki instead crumpled into a chair inside the bar and just sat there looking like she had been knocked down. And then, after a few moments of sitting there taking in the reality of what was happening, she couldn't help but start talking. The information that was trapped inside of Vicki just poured out of her, like the floodgates holding everything back had finally just been utterly destroyed. Vicki really needed to get this story out in the open, and finally relieve herself of this burden she had been carrying for the past 3 years. This secret she had been holding inside was eating her alive, and she was more than willing to come clean. Vicki fully admitted that she was indeed the one driving Charlotte's car that day, but that was just the beginning of her confessions. She went on to describe the gruesome details of what happened to Charlotte Grabbe that night and the following day. Vicki recounted to Pearson that on the day that Charlotte had gone missing, she and Fred were in the machine shed where Charlotte's tractor was found. They were in there because Fred wanted to get some 55-gallon metal barrels. He needed these barrels to do some work on the farm. But as they were getting these barrels, they heard Charlotte's tractor coming. Vicki wasn't supposed to be there, and Fred did not want to be caught red-handed with his mistress in the machine shed. So he told Vicki to hide behind another tractor that was inside the shed. While Vicki was hiding, she said that she seen Fred leave the shed in order to meet Charlotte outside. Charlotte must not have expected Fred to be there, and Vicki could hear that outside, Fred and Charlotte had gotten into a heated argument, and that argument escalated as they came back inside the shed. From her hiding spot, Vicki could see that Fred was consumed with rage, and eventually, Fred could not control that rage any longer. Vicki watched in horror as Fred reached his hands out and wrapped them around Charlotte's neck. He then began to strangle her. With his bare hands, Vicki watched as he choked Charlotte up until the point where she was almost unconscious. Once she was about to pass out, Fred released his grip and let her regain consciousness. And then, once Charlotte was partially recovered, Fred choked her again, and he would repeat this over and over and over again until eventually he choked Charlotte to death. Vicki, now looking physically ill, went on to tell Pearson that once Charlotte was dead, Fred did something that was beyond the realm of murder. While Charlotte's body lay on the ground in the machine shed, Fred didn't think twice about it and proceeded to violate Charlotte's corpse while Vicki watched from behind the tractor. After that, Fred started searching around the shed looking for something. He looked all over the place and eventually he found what he was after. His grease gun. He picked it up and then went over to Charlotte's body where he proceeded to fill Charlotte's body with grease, inserting the grease gun nozzle into every single orifice of her body in order to get the grease inside. He then crumpled her body into one of the 55-gallon barrels and loaded the barrel onto the back of his pickup truck. Satisfied with himself, Fred called Vicki out of her hiding spot and told her to follow him in Charlotte's car as he drove his truck across the state line into Indiana. That night, they dumped Charlotte's car outside of a bar 16 miles away in Indiana, and then together in Fred's truck, they drove back to the farm and parked near the Wabash River. There, Fred took the barrel out of his truck and placed it near a maple tree, where he poured diesel fuel into the barrel, covering Charlotte's body. He then lit it on fire. Fred and Vicky sat on the riverbank while the diesel fuel and the grease inside of Charlotte's body burned slowly all night long. When morning came the next day, they loaded the drum with Charlotte's charred body inside back up into Fred's truck and headed to Vicky's house. That evening, at sunset, they piled back into the truck and went back to the river. They then put the barrel in the same spot where it had been the night before and then lit it on fire again. And again, it burned through the night. The next morning, Fred decided that that was enough. He pushed the barrel onto its side and then proceeded to roll it into the river, where the only body part remaining of Charlotte at this point was her skull, which Frank just picked up and threw it into the river without a second thought. Vicky's confession helped, but it simply wasn't enough. Prosecutors needed some sort of physical evidence to charge Fred. With no body, no barrel, no murder weapon, investigators needed something besides Vicky McAllister's word against Fred's word. But after hearing Vicky's story, the sheriff in Clark County was curious if the maple tree that was still standing at the burn site could somehow be used to shed some light on the investigation. He reached out to the University of Illinois, and during the conversation they had, the sheriff learned that during the natural life cycle of a tree, the seasons will cause a tree to grow in the spring and summer, and then it will go dormant in the winter. This process each year is what creates the rings in the tree trunk, as well as the branches, and each of these rings will show the growth of the tree for that year. It was thought that since diesel fuel is highly toxic to a tree, and if it doesn't kill the tree, it will at the very least hamper its growth. And so samples of the maple tree's branches were taken, and under analysis it was concluded that 3 rings deep, so 3 years ago, the growth of the tree had been impacted by something, because the rings were much thinner than all of the other years. The tree had gone through some sort of stress the summer that Charlotte had gone missing. Then, to go even further, they took the samples and shredded them into sawdust. The sawdust was then analyzed using a device that identifies the different components of a sample, and the analysis of the sawdust found the presence of hydrocarbons, which are found in diesel products. With Vicky's confession and the forensic evidence provided by the maple tree, Fred was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But just hold on, because this story isn't over yet. No. Over the course of Fred's trial, he had somehow managed to gain the support of his latest girlfriend, Barbara Graham, and she would turn out to be the same type of person as Fred. A few weeks after Fred's conviction, while he was being held in the Clark County Jail, out of nowhere, Barbara showed up. That day, she told the deputy sheriff that she just wanted to give Fred a love note. And so, when the deputy sheriff opened the door, Barbara pulled out a gun and started firing at the officers inside the building. She managed to let off 5 shots, with one of them hitting the deputy sheriff in the leg before she was apprehended. Barbara had intended on springing Fred out of jail, but instead, she was sentenced to 16 years in prison. During Fred's time in jail, his lawyers filed an appeal of his verdict, and as a result, Fred's first conviction was overturned on a simple technicality, resulting in a second trial. Just a month before Fred's second trial, Fred's son Jeff, who had testified against Fred in the first trial, had vanished. Jeff was on a business trip in California when everyone lost contact with him. By the time the trial was set to begin, Jeff was still missing, and so in his absence, the judge decided that Jeff's wife Cindy could testify on Jeff's behalf. And at the end of Fred's second trial, he was convicted again, and this time he was sentenced to 75 years in prison with the possibility of parole. Sadly, 1 month after the trial concluded, Jeff's body was found floating in the water at Seal Beach in California. An autopsy showed that he had sustained 3 bullets to his chest, and an anchor had been tied to him in an effort to keep his body submerged. To this day, Fred denies having anything to do with his son's murder, and the murder of Jeff Grabbe has never been solved. In 2022, Fred was granted parole and was released from prison. Vicky McAllister still lives in fear that Fred will somehow find her and take his revenge for her confessions. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit all of the notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. And I will see you again later.